I would put it that way. Josh, what are your thoughts about the direction of the U.S.-Israel relationship under a new administration?
Yeah, I think Lisa's points were spot on, and I'll just add two really quick things. Number one, personnel is policy. So a lot of times you don't necessarily trust the principal, but you got to look at their top advisors. And without going into all, we don't know who's going to be SecDef, SecState, National Security Advisor. But if you look at the top advisors that really Biden feels comfortable with, these are folks with deep familiarity with Netanyahu, with the pro-Israel community. And if you look at the folks that were kind of had Obama's ear, they were not folks, in certain cases at least. But Ben Rhodes probably comes to mind most prominently. But there are a lot of other folks who were shaping national security that reflected Obama's views that were a little heterodox at the time. And these are not national security folks that are likely going to have a spot in a future Biden administration. And I think Lisa's point was really important about just the broader politics of Israel policy. If you look at the polling, yes, there's younger liberal Democrats have shown less support for Israel, and Republicans have pretty much solidified behind support for Israel in the last 4 years. But the overall top lines of support for Israel have been pretty constant when you look at every single significant reputable poll. We're talking like 2/3 of Americans have a strong view, a supportive view of the U.S.-Israel relationship. So the notion that like a Biden administration would come in trying to pick a fight on that front doesn't make a lot of political sense, just from a pure looking at the electoral consequences point of view. That is not something that the Jewish vote is a big part, as Lisa said, of the Democratic base. And there are liberal Zionists, there are liberal voters that were uncomfortable with some of Obama's positions on the Middle East, even if they ended up voting for him. So I don't think that Biden's going to want to pick a fight in the family that would be very divisive, as we've seen over times in the last 4 years between the left and the moderates in the party on Israel.
Yeah, well, of course, you're pointing to something else which is significant, which is the generational shift that we may be seeing occur. Because, as opposed to just the alignment of political personalities, Trump and Netanyahu getting along and so forth, and then Biden now forging his own relationship as president with the Israelis. But the fact that we're losing, for example, some very stalwart pro-Israel members of Congress like Elliot Engel and Nita Lowey and Joe Crowley lost a primary to Ocasio-Cortez. These are longtime pro-Israel members of Congress, and they're being replaced by younger people who may not share the same views. So this also very much impacts the equation. I want to ask you about another important concern of ours, which is combating anti-Semitism and anti-Israel hatred. And of course, this should always be a bipartisan value, no question about it. But sometimes it seems like Democrats have an easier time spotting anti-Semitism on the far right, and Republicans have an easier time spotting it on the far left or among Islamist extremists. And as we said, President-elect Biden will have to deal with the progressive wing of his party. And this includes someone like Congresswoman Ilhan Omar, who actually has engaged in anti-Semitism by propagating stereotypes about money and power and demonizing Israel as recently as this month with accusations of ethnic cleansing. It also includes people who are not anti-Semitic, but who support for BDS, the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, and in conditioning U.S. aid to Israel based on Israeli politics, are deeply problematic for the bilateral relationship. So aside from, taking a different stance from these people that, as President Biden may very well do on some key issues, how forthright do you think he will be as president in reining in these elements of his own party, calling out moments when their criticism of Israeli policy crosses the line, for example, and other excesses of anti-Israel hatred?
I think there are two encouraging signs in our broader politics that suggest things may be changing for the better, without speaking to Biden specifically at first. I mean, number one, anti-Semitism thrives when extremism, when folks are kind of playing to each other's extremes and bases. And we saw that. I mean, that was a big concern, obviously, in the Trump era, where he would kind of, overtly signal to supporters of his that were anti-Semitic, or having these awful stereotypes. And even if he didn't say it, even if people in his administration weren't saying it, he was sort of giving succor to some of these extremes. And the same thing on the left, that Pelosi really had a hard time even getting a resolution condemning Omar's anti-Semitism through her own caucus because of objections from elements of her progressive caucus. I mean, I think the fact that you have a more moderate, more pragmatic voice at the top should, and it's not going to change overnight, but should at least tamp down some of the extremes. Again, you can't put everything back in a bottle right away, but I think that the trend is an encouraging one. It's certainly more encouraging than if Democrats nominated someone who was much more progressive, much more from the activist wing of their own party. I mean, and you're asking about Biden. The question is, how much political courage is he able to muster if you do have another issue? You mentioned the Omar, it's all about the Benjamins tweet. There are a small number of folks in their caucus that are hard to restrain, and they're probably going to say things like that. And I think it'll be a good early test for a Biden administration whether he is willing to spend that political capital to condemn those types of comments. I will say, just from a larger political point, in these tribal times and these partisan times, it doesn't matter if someone's on the left is attacking Trump, or Trump is attacking someone on the left, or Republicans are attacking Democrats, or Democrats are attacking Republicans. The biggest movement in fighting this kind of hatred and anti-Semitism is when someone in your own party speaks out against someone else in your own party that's not behaving in a responsible way. And that has been lacking in these last 4 years. There's reason for hope, but as the quote from Ronald Reagan says, trust but verify. I think we're going to be doing a lot of verifying to see where our body politic is these next few years as we change administrations and change styles of governance.